So good morning, everyone, and welcome to 2020 Liberal Arts Symposium on Zoom. Why not? That's what I say. Why not? But we are very happy to be present, to hear about the incredible work that you have been doing and celebrate your accomplishments. So we're going to begin with Laura Chiarella. This is her honors thesis, and it is The Influences of Postmodern Fairy Tales and Over the Garden Wall, 2014. So please, Laura, begin.
Oh, hi, thank you for coming. Hope traffic wasn't too terrible. So my name is Laura, and I will be presenting on influences of postmodern fairy tales in Over the Garden Wall. So Over the Garden Wall is a Cartoon Network miniseries created by Patrick McHale. It follows two brothers, Wirt and Greg. Wirt is the older brother and Greg is the younger brother, as they travel through this mysterious forest called the Unknown, and they're trying to find their way home since they're lost. They meet all different kinds of people, and they find that the landscape they are traversing includes a number of influences, time periods, and aesthetics. I became really interested in this fluctuating use of all these different kinds of references throughout the show. It really intrigued me what they were using and why they were using it and how they were using it and what it was doing for the series. In order to understand what was happening and why, I found that by combining these influences and conventions in such a way, the show was actually breaking them down and changing them. And that is what led me to look at the show through a postmodern approach. So by analyzing Over the Garden Wall 2014 through a postmodern lens, I ultimately argue that it reevaluates traditional conceptions of identity in society by recontextualizing and disrupting expectations of animated fairy tales through techniques such as fragmentation, pastiche, and contradiction. And I guided my analysis through three questions. How does Over the Garden Wall utilize established fairy tale conventions? How do established conventions and techniques of animation influence Over the Garden Wall? And how does Over the Garden Wall create and sustain ideologies of identity in a community? So I developed these three research questions to guide my analysis, and each of these questions focused on three different sections that make up the bulk of my literature review. So first of all, fairy tales. Fairy tales are considered to be a subgenre of the overarching umbrella of folk tales. They are distinct from myths, legends, and fables. And I found that my overarching criteria for fairy tales was the use of fantastical elements, reoccurring motifs, a vagueness that suspends reality, formulaic tendencies, and admonition, as opposed to something more didactic, which is more closely aligned with the literary genre when fairy tales became more moralistic and aimed at children. Next, I explored animation, primarily focusing on Disney's influence, because Disney dominates the animation industry and really defined the way fairy tales are used in animation. I looked at how he transferred fairy tales into his films, which was a very personalized and ideologically Americanized way. I also looked at the kind of mechanics and development of his Disney aesthetic that is still very pervasive today. However, I also do examine his relationship with other earlier animated works and animators, the early history of animation, especially looking at like a 1920s, 1930s style. And then there was the application of postmodernism. Postmodernism is difficult to define, but it is a reaction to modernist assumptions and meta-narratives. Especially in regards to truth, reality, postmodernism aims to question what we assume about these things, and often does so in an ironic way. Postmodernism is a skeptical attitude to established ideas with a sensitivity to ideology. Some techniques of postmodernism, especially the ones I'm concerned with here, are playfulness, fragmentation, pastiche, which should not be confused with parody or satire, as pastiche is celebrating the styles it imitates. These three areas, animation and postmodernism, to create a synthesized analysis. So I thought the clearest way to go over how I'm doing this is to just look at a little clip of the show. So this is just a short part in the introductory sequence when we first meet the characters.
Somewhere lost in the clouded annals of history lies a place that few have seen. A mysterious place called the Unknown, where long-forgotten stories are revealed to those who travel through the wood.
Albert Salami, Giggly Jumpy Tom Thomas Tambourine, Leg Face McCullen, Artichoke, Penguin Pete Steve. But I think the very worst name for this frog is...
Wait a second. Greg?
Somewhere
Oops.
along.
So first I will look over how Over the Garden Wall is utilizing these established fairy tale conventions. So once upon a time in a certain country 1,000 years ago, such beginnings suggest what follows does not pertain to the here and now that we know. This deliberate vagueness in the beginnings of fairy tales symbolizes that we are leaving the concrete world of the ordinary reality. The impenetrable woods all suggest that something normally hidden will be revealed, while long ago implies that we are going to learn about the most archaic events. So, as Bettelheim asserts, fairy tales are known for having a particular yet vague kinds of beginnings in order to separate reality from the story and set up narrative expectations. The opening narration of Over the Garden Wall initiates the story in a way that aligns with that vague formulaic phrasing typically used to signify the beginnings of fairy tales, such as once upon a time. So the fairy tale-ness of the story is indicated through words such as somewhere, lost, mysterious. Yet, even as the narration performs the common function of inducing a particular kind of fantasy world through intentionally vague wording, it is combined with unique language, like annals and history, that offers a certain sense of reality to ground the rest of the fantastical assertions. So this posits that the unknown, the forest, while a strange and difficult place to reach, can be found somewhere between fantasy and reality as a liminal space. So by combining and altering conventions of fairy tales' formulaic phrasing, the unknown is situated between reality and fantasy rather than complete fantasy. This is fantastical enough to allow the audience to maintain traditional expectations of a fairy tale, but its deviations from the fairy tale formula also promise to disrupt these expectations. By establishing the liminality of the setting and disrupting expectation, the series asserts its intention to explore thresholds in the unknown by establishing a fluctuating dichotomy of fantasy and reality. But yes, so when we first see Wirt and Greg, we don't know anything about them other than how they look. We know that we have been introduced to the world called the unknown that is kind of a fairy tale sensibility combined with influences of Americana. As Greg lists unsuitable names for the frog, the pervasive question of identity is raised. But when we first meet Wirt and Greg, we assume they belong to the fairy tale world because they visually match our cultural expectations of fairy tale imagery and how a character in a fairy tale might look, especially Wirt, because his pointy red hat and cape specifically portrays like a gnome or dwarf-like character. Even Greg's more confusing look is acceptable and points to popularly disseminated images of American folktales, like Johnny Appleseed. But overall, we've been dropped into this world that we are making sense of by understanding it as a fairy tale setting. The idea of lost children, children lost in an enchanted wood, is a really common fairy tale premise, such as Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, Babes in the Wood, just to name a few. So the opening narration, the cultural imagery, and tale type support the fairy tale status of the world and perpetuate an expectation of Wirt and Greg's relationship to this world. However, by infusing Americana aesthetics in a European fairy tale, this pastiche style questions the narrative expectations it is also propagating. Fairy tales serve as cultural mirrors, reflecting our world in order to offer guidance. But in this case, the mirror is fragmenting as influences blend and fluctuating dichotomies are established, which is further supported by the use of animation, which I will discuss now. So looking back on the first shot of the unknown, the extreme silhouette of the forest and the characters likely mimic the styles of 1920s silhouette animation, as well as the folk tradition of paper cutting with partially inspired silhouette animation. And though we don't realize it yet, the bird here is actually a character introduced later, foreshadowing events. So the scenery is extremely rendered. If you look closely, you can see the chalk pastel kind of textures in the background, and they are inspired by 19th century romantic landscape paintings. There is a lot of depth of detail. They're really immersive as they build the shifting atmospheres of the unknown. And furthermore, Wirt and Greg's character design contradicts the environment. Compared to the background, Wirt and Greg are very flat, very two-dimensional. They don't have a lot of depth, and they're animated in this kind of thin line style, derived from a clean Disney aesthetic. However, Wirt and Greg's design is very geometrically stylized, with like lots of circles and long limbs, and that actually recalls the style of early cartoons, like rubber hose animation. So this pastiche of visual styles contributes to the same sense of fluctuation that the blend of cultural aesthetics maintain. So how does Over the Garden Wall create and sustain ideologies of identity in a community? So you're not meant to be able to identify and catalog all of the influences throughout the show. It's kind of impossible. But the point of the audience seeing this combination of influences, are some recognizable and some not, is that by doing so, Over the Garden Wall is creating a dichotomy of what is familiar and unfamiliar, in addition to the dichotomy of fantasy and reality. And there are even more thresholds explored throughout the show, but I'll focus on those. So by confusing what is familiar and unfamiliar, fantasy and reality, our expectations of identity are created and then contradicted, fragmented, disrupted, and shifted. Ultimately, our contextual traditional expectations of identity are uprooted, and thus question the ideological origins of our expectations. When fairy tales developed into the literary genre, they became stagnant and focused on civilizing our behavior, the behavior of its consumers, a practice that was translated into animation as Disney interpreted these tales. But ultimately, the survival of these tales hinges on their evolution, as seen in Over the Garden Wall, and their postmodern interpretation. So the ability to change is at the core of these fairy tale narratives, just as it is at the core of both individual and cultural identities. So, so yeah, here I'll just talk about some of my limitations quickly. Obviously, I experienced a bit of a time constraint. I only was able to dedicate one semester to this study, and as well as the abrupt end of the semester. By balancing all these disciplines, I had to make choices on what I wanted to focus on. So it's kind of juggling these different fields of study. I'd like to just go more in depth on the synthesis of these things I'm exploring. If I was to go even further, though, I think it might be interesting to compare with other mediums of postmodern interpretations of fairy tales, or, you know, compare Eastern animation's interpretation of folk tales to Western versions. And so just to conclude, 2 more quotes on identity. Each fairy tale is a magic mirror which reflects some aspects of our inner world. For those who immerse themselves in what the fairy tale has to communicate, it becomes a deep, quiet pool, which first seems to reflect only our own image. But behind it, we soon discover the inner turmoils of our soul, its depth, and ways to gain peace within ourselves and with the world, which is the reward of our struggles. And then, but where have we gone and where shall we end? If dreams can't come true, then why not pretend? Fairy tales originally were meant to provide a source of guidance to us all. And I think that by looking back and revisiting these tales and how we see them in our culture today, they have something to offer us in terms of finding our roles in the world and ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, very much. Yeah. There we go. Is there anyone who has a question for Laura? You can, I think, raise your hand and I can, oh, well, you've got applause. That's good. Applause is good. Anybody want to ask her a tough question, please?
Yeah.
Besides me? Hi, Brendan.
Hi there. Yeah, I wanted to ask, what is your interpretation of Over the Garden Wall's use of religious imagery? Because we have the figure of the beast as this shadowy horned figure, and also his name is the beast. Of course, he's meant to represent Satan. There's also the bluebird, Beatrice, who has the same name as Dante's love in the Divine Comedy. So how do you think the show uses religion?
Yeah, so there actually have been some studies on how Over the Garden Wall is kind of an allegory for Dante's Inferno. And I actually, when Patrick McHale was developing the show, he wanted to make the Beast character a more Judeo-Christian devil type character, but Cartoon Network was like, we can't have that. So I think that the intersection of a kind of secular imagery with this religious imagery, I think, continues to point to the kind of pastiche that Over the Garden Wall is creating. So by identifying both fairy tale elements and religious elements, it contributes to the fragmentation of what is familiar to us and what is unfamiliar to us. So I think just all this entire blend of what we're seeing just helps us be confused in a way. It supports that dichotomy of what we're recognizing and what we're not. That's a good question.
Yeah, great question. It's actually all we're going to have time for, so I'm glad it was a knockout. Okay. Thank you very much. If Rebecca, if you could set up, that would be great. We'll give the screen over to you. Okay. And if you, go into show mode. There we go. All right. So everyone, please help me welcome Rebecca Case, who did a paper in the metaverse on the digital divide, how an online society affects those who are unplugged. So I'm not sure what we do, wave our hands, but welcome Rebecca and have at it.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca, and today I'm going to be talking about the digital divide. Often in today's society, many of us find ourselves taking advantage of digital technology. It is something we always expect to be available when we need to look up an answer to a question or watch a television show, movie, or YouTube video. Most of us do not stop and worry about whether or not this technology will be available to us when we need it, or if we will have the proper skills in order to use it. We tend to believe that these problems are reserved for developing countries who are not as well off as the United States. However, for millions of Americans, the problems of the digital divide are a prevalent part in their everyday lives. As many of us have seen during the current pandemic situation, as many Americans struggle to keep up with the fact that schooling and work must now be completed online. Mm-hmm. In order to be a member of today's society, having the proper access to digital technology is necessary in order to understand it. Yet we still see the prevalence of the digital divide among certain demographics and populations in the United States, even in 2020. I argue that the digital divide in America stems from the lack of access to broadband services among certain groups in America, causing poor digital literacy, which affects our identities and ultimately leads to a cultural shift, placing power in the hands of those who can confidently navigate the digital world. And I'm going to be using 3 points to emphasize my point, starting off with the lack of access to broadband services, then moving on to the lack of digital literacy among certain generations, and then ending with how in an increasingly digital society, those who can easily navigate the online world have the most power. So first off, I'm going to define the digital divide, which is defined as the patterns of unequal access to information technology based on income, race, ethnicity, gender, age, and geography. The modern digital divide in America is mainly due to the lack of access to broadband services and the lack of digital literacy among older generations. So first, I'm going to talk about the lack of access to broadband services. Broadband services are described as a download speed of at least 25 megabits per second and an upload speed of 3 megabits per second. This describes downloading speeds that make using digital technology easier and more effective. Having broadband services at home is necessary for everyday tasks such as homework, connecting with others, staying up to date with current events, searching for jobs, and filling out job applications. However, as of 2016, 34 million Americans had little to no access to broadband services at home. A survey conducted by the MIT Technological Review in 2016 revealed that the main reason that people did not have broadband services at home was that it was too expensive, with 59% of people listing this as their main reason. So who are the people that are affected? It is mainly rural Americans and inner city Americans that are affected the most. The Pew Research Center found that as of February 2019, 63% of rural homes did not have access to broadband services. And cities like Cleveland and Detroit rank among the worst connected cities in the country, with many inner city families relying on cell phones or their local libraries for important work. This is a serious problem in these low-income neighborhoods where their libraries might be underfunded and therefore not have access to the proper resources, or a trip to the library might not be safe. Furthermore, relying on cell phones to complete work is not a sufficient substitute for a desktop computer or a laptop. Another issue brought up by broadband services is the homework gap, which affects students who do not have proper technology at home to complete their schoolwork. According to the Pew Research Center, as of October 2018, 17% of students are unable to complete their homework because of the lack of access to technology at home. Without access to home broadband services, students fall behind their peers in schoolwork, in addition to not learning how to navigate and become familiar with digital technology. In addition to the lack of access to broadband services, the lack of access to digital technology often leads to poor digital literacy. Digital literacy is defined as the ability to confidently navigate digital technology in order to evaluate and interpret online information. Often this problem is seen in older Americans who are often unwilling to put the time and effort into learning how to become digitally literate, which stems from mistrust, high-risk perceptions, and a strong desire for privacy. Many older Americans do not see the internet as a trustworthy place and do not believe that they are safe when navigating it. For instance, many older Americans may be able to look up something online, but then they have trouble being able to distinguish the trustworthy sources from the untrustworthy ones. This problem further affects their perception of the internet as a whole, making them more reluctant to use the internet. The problem of digital literacy has many ramifications, especially in the mHealth field. Mobile health, or mHealth, refers to being able to access healthcare information on mobile digital devices. Many healthcare organizations encourage mHealth practices among their patients because it can help foster the development of proactive patients while also reducing financial burden and resource pressures on health. Despite the many benefits to mHealth applications, studies show that in many underserved populations, the digital literacy required to navigate these applications is severely lacking, demonstrating a bias in favor of wealthier, younger, and white populations. Many people have the access to mobile phones, but their healthcare providers cannot offer texting services because their plans won't cover it. Without proper access to mHealth technology, it is often harder to get a hold of these families in case of medical emergencies, while also limiting their opportunities to understand their healthcare. Many healthcare providers are switching to have a dominant online presence to keep track of records and be more organized, which is yet another barrier. There are also problems within the professional field. In many cases, those who are less digitally literate do not have the knowledge that they need to go online to search for job applications. And even when they do find them, they have trouble figuring out how to fill them out. However, even if they get to the point where they can find a job and fill out the application, they most likely do not have the required skills needed to be considered a serious candidate. Many jobs today require basic knowledge of how to operate computer programs such as Word and Excel, and how to send and receive emails. Not only low-income populations are at a disadvantage. While many younger generations this may seem like easy tasks, it is much harder for older generations to figure out how to operate them, and many give up thinking they can find a job without these skills. However, this mindset is dangerous and results in many people finding that they are stuck in their positions at work, unable to get promoted because their coworkers have surpassed them in terms of digital skills. This negatively affects their identities, often with them feeling insufficient due to being unable to complete simple tasks that others around them can finish with ease. Thankfully, libraries across the country are working to become sources for bridging the digital gap. For example, many libraries offer classes for patrons to take, including how to send and receive emails, how to use Word, Excel, and other computer programs, how to apply for jobs and fill out applications, and apply for licenses. These classes are important in teaching others how to become full citizens of the digital world because they involve teaching skills that many of us are not aware that we need. In addition to offering classes, libraries also provide many other useful services. Many take advantage of the library's free Wi-Fi access and access to laptops and desktop computers. Libraries across the country offer the option to check out free Wi-Fi hotspots, just like someone would check out a book or a laptop. Still, many library patrons spend time on the library's Wi-Fi. A study of the 68 libraries in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania found that as of 2016, library patrons spend 37% more time accessing internet through Wi-Fi than through library-owned computers. Many times this is due to the fact that home broadband costs more than these devices. People bring their own devices to the library to use the public Wi-Fi instead of logging onto the library's computers. In fact, the amount of Wi-Fi minutes library patrons used from 2012 to 2016 went up by more than 50%, while the number of PC minutes remained relatively the same. Public Wi-Fi is important because it allows for people to have access to resources that they might not have at home. In addition to lack of access to broadband services and digital literacy, in an increasingly digital society, those who can easily navigate the online world begin to have the most power, leaving those who lack these skills behind. As the digital age progresses, those who are left behind feel hopeless, thinking that they will never have enough time to catch up to others, with new inventions and discoveries in the digital world occurring every day. The digital world is a new environment which necessitates different roles, voice tones, gestures, diction, and interactions, leaving those who do not understand or do not have access to this environment having to adopt more isolated roles within society, separating people from those who can communicate online and those who cannot. They feel left out on vital methods of professional and personal communication that is necessary to survive in the age of cyberculture. In an increasingly digital society, those who can easily navigate the online world begin to have the most power. With the rise of cyberculture, many scholars have predicted a new rise in post-materialism values. Post-materialism is defined as the theory that suggests that economic and technological development produce profound transformations in the social and economic system, and that these in turn lead to fundamental shifts in underlying social and political values. In other words, advances in culture often lead to changes in social structures and traditional values in society. This could be seen in the counterculture movements of the 60s and 70s, with the younger generations protesting the more traditional values of their parents and arguing for new ways of life. Now in the digital age, a resurgence of post-materialism has begun to emerge. We as a society are currently witnessing how social media and the internet have the power to give movement to many social issues and topics, which is in turn giving power to the demographics who are leading these changes. Those who are among the ages of 15 to 30 are on their way to becoming more powerful than older adults because they are able to spread their messages to the masses in a relatively fast and efficient way. It used to be that those who read and had access to print material had the power, but because of technology, we are witnessing a shift with those who are digitally literate beginning to have a more dominant role in society, shaping how we go about our lives. The online community is disproportionately young, affluent, and well-educated, making it a place for those younger, wealthy people to find their voice and spread their messages they care about among like-minded people. This furthers the gap within society, causing a bigger digital divide as people struggle to keep up with those who can pass their agenda through social media. The internet creates a space that allows for more points of view, allowing those with access to it to create a more fluid sense of self with a greater capacity for acknowledging diversity. It is this quality of open-mindedness that creates well-versed citizens of the world and can incorporate many points of view into their arguments based on the opinions they find online in order to maximize their following. This is in contrast to those without access to these online communities, who are less aware of the opinions of others and therefore have less pull when trying to reach a wider audience. Ultimately, the digital divide creates a gap between those who are digitally literate and those who are not, resulting in a power shift throughout the nation. These issues are seen everywhere from wealthy to low-income communities, although it disproportionately affects the poor and older citizens, as well as racial and ethnic minorities. These are all problems within the United States, which is considerably more well off in terms of digital access than most countries in the world, mainly developing nations. However, the fact that we can see these implications of this divide within our own developed society proves how much of a problem the digital divide has become. Thank you. And any questions?
Thank you, Rebecca. That was very, very stimulating, especially in this time of pandemic. Well done. Questions? And it occurs to me that, we have about 3 minutes for questions, but you could also put questions in the chat so that if they can't get to them now, or if you just want to comment, they will see it. They will see your comments in the chat. So, anyone have a question for Rebecca? I have one about libraries. I mean, obviously they are shut down during the pandemic. What do you know about the people who had relied on them so heavily? Are libraries hearing from those people, and are they completely shut off without that access?
I think that those who have no access to the libraries, that like live in inner city communities, I know that in Pittsburgh, where I live, that the inner city schools are getting laptops distributed to them, but it's taking a really long time to get it out, and they're not really having the library's help at this time since they're all closed.
Yeah. Anyone else want to raise a question? Please talk. There are 57 of you. I just.
Great job, Rebecca. I love this topic. I'm curious if you're a proponent for municipal Wi-Fi, if you see the internet as a right, access to the internet as a right, extended maybe beyond libraries to communities.
I definitely do think that it should be a right, because if everyone has the same access to it, they will have the same opportunities to go online and have the same amount of opportunity to research things and find jobs and get the necessary skills that they need to live in our online society.
Well, you're getting terrific recommendations in the chat, so you'll have to look at them later, Rebecca. You've stimulated a lot of interest here. Thank you very much. And Peter, if you would like to take control, that'd be cool. All right. There we are. So please help me welcome, quietly, I guess, Peter Rankin, who is presenting his honors thesis. And I'll let him say that big title. All right,
Hello.
take it away, Peter.
Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Rankin. Thank you for coming to LAS today. And what I would like to talk to you today about is theater. So my study is the New Age theater and ideological analysis of the corporatization of Broadway using Disney's Aladdin. So what that means is, if we look at this quote from Stella Adler, an actress and acting theorist, what's important to note here, she says, theater was created to tell the truth about life and social situations. It acts as a cultural mirror. It reflects our perceptions and it reflects our realities. And although it's long been recognized and studied as an art form, and it should be, if you look at the commercial success of theater on Broadway and at an industrial level, I would argue we also need to be looking at how theater has an impact as a media sector and how it shapes our cultural content. And if we acknowledge this, then we also need to be look at how that media has been shifting with the introduction of large media conglomerates, such as the Disney company, into the Broadway market. Now, for this study, I specifically pick on Disney because they're the largest content creator in the world, and they're also the largest corporate enterprise currently on Broadway. And fundamentally, they're a transmedia-driven business, meaning what they bring to Broadway are pre-established franchises and characters. And so the art and the shows that they create on Broadway are an extension of their Disney universe, which is fundamentally different than how theater has always sort of been produced on Broadway, which is a lot more original pieces or standalone pieces. So for this actual critique, in order to look at how Disney and corporatization is impacting Broadway, I chose to look specifically at Aladdin, the 2014 production, not necessarily as a case study, but as a lens that allows me to look at Disney's corporate and ideological practices. I chose Aladdin for a couple reasons. It's their second highest grossing musical of all time, right behind Lion King. It's one of the highest grossing musicals of all time, just in general, as well as they just had a film remake come out. There's a lot of access to it, and for this particular research, it was just readily available. Now, in terms of what I did to conduct this study, I didn't have a set methodology that I followed. It was more of a generative critique in which I synthesized a bunch of social theorists' ideologies and ideas to formulate my own critique, which is then rooted in these three ideological questions, which basically ask, how does Aladdin, and by extension Disney, impact Broadway from an artistic standpoint, from an industrial standpoint, and from an ideological standpoint? Now, all of these questions are rooted in a bunch of ideological assumptions based off of the various sociologists that I studied. And for the purposes of this presentation, because I don't have a lot of time and I could talk all day about this, these are just some baseline stats for the assumptions that my research is rooted in. I'm going to talk about my findings, basically, and what's important to understand is they're based in these ideological assumptions. Important to note is that theater as an art form is meant to both entertain and enlighten, and that if we look at art and how it's created in a capitalistic system, corporations, large corporations like Disney, recognize profit as the determining factor in what they do to make their decisions. So with that said, I use an ideological analysis of the Broadway production Aladdin to exemplify the franchise and profit-driven nature of corporate Disney and examine how the privileging of profit over artistic value interacts and reshapes Broadway through corporatization. And what we find is that on the production level, on the artistry level, and on the ideological level, Aladdin not only reaffirms the Disney imperative and ideological imperative, but actually reifies it. So what that means is, if we're looking first from an industrial level, Disney's corporate strategy basically has 4 core tenets to it: product development, market penetration, market development, and diversification. What that basically means is they'll find a market, they'll have a product that they've created, they'll expand upon it in the markets they already own, they'll then move into a new market, they'll extend that product into that market, and if they have to buy up other businesses along the way to increase their sort of corporate power, they'll do that as well. What's important, and what specifically we kind of need to look at in terms of their impact and corporatization on Broadway, is their idea about market development, where they're introducing an existing product into a new market segment. Here I've sort of laid out the Disney corporate structure. And what you can sort of see is that there's central management all the way up at the top that oversees their 4 main sectors, which are their media networks, parks, studios, and then interactive media. And then under that, I've listed just a few of the many, many, many enterprises that the Disney company owns. I've taken the liberty of bolding Disney Theatrical Group, which is the parent company to Disney's Broadway production wing, which is Disney Theatrical Productions. And all of this is basically just to show that Disney Theatrical Productions, the company that produced Aladdin, is just a very, very small segment of the overall media empire that is Disney. They're taking the Aladdin franchise, which has been established in films and books and television, and they're moving it now into Broadway theater. And what that means in terms of Aladdin is it offers all of these strategic and competitive advantages against other Broadway production companies. And what it means for those production companies is that basically now they're not just competing to meet the needs of their own consumer base and their own audiences, they're also competing against these sort of corporate ideologies and this corporate space that is now being taken up. They don't have the resources to compete straight up with a large enterprise like the Disney Corporation. So they have to work on different means of fundraising, working through partnerships, identifying how they can create art that's going to be competitive against something that is large and spectacle-esque like Disney's Aladdin. And when I say it's spectacle-esque, that's where we sort of start getting into the artistry of Aladdin. So when we look at the artistry of Aladdin, this is a direct quote from the director of the show, Casey Nicholaw. And he basically said this when the show was transitioning from its Toronto run before it got onto Broadway to when it was about to start running on Broadway. And what he's basically saying here in the full quote is that he felt the show was too Broadway for its own good, and that it wasn't true enough to the original film. Now, of course, we all love fidelity. We love it when films are true to the book that they're based on, and we really do enjoy that. But when you privilege fidelity over artistry, especially in this case, the purpose of the show itself becomes not to necessarily entertain artistically, but to invite the audience to partake in sort of that constructed reality of the Disney universe. The art becomes subsidiary to the quote unquote magic of Disney. Now, this doesn't mean that every single piece has to tie directly back to the film or that nostalgia feeling, but the iconic looks, the characters, and the feelings that are embedded in the psyche of the audience in relation to Aladdin, and by extension, their relation to Disney, they need to remain in order for that magic to really take place and for people to be transported into this world. And we can see that in the design. Here is one of the scenes. This is the Cave of Wonders after Aladdin has snuck in to try to steal the genie's lamp and all of that. And you can see it's big, it's loud, it takes up the full stage, it's glittery, it's shiny. They have a huge, huge music number in this sort of golden cathedral, you could call it. And the whole point is it's supposed to remind you of the Cave of Wonders in the original film. It transports you back to that Aladdin universe, that Disney universe. Same thing here with the city of Agrabah and how it's represented on the stage. Of course, there are technical differences, and to some effect, yes, this is artistic decision, and the artistry does matter. But the colors, the costumes, it's all predicated and based on reestablishing that sort of Aladdin-ness and the Disney-ness of the show. And again, this happens when we see Jasmine and Aladdin on the magic carpet ride scene. Disney actually had to invent new technology in order to get that magic carpet to work the way that they wanted to, so that it fit into the scheme of the show. And I say all of this because if we actually look at the iconic characters, so Jasmine, Aladdin, and Jafar specifically, just like the landscapes and the songs and all the imagery, these are they take on a meaning outside of a normal character. The characters themselves are the very core of the Disney franchise, of the Disney reality. And so, for example, the production manager for the show, the person they hired to play Jafar in the original Broadway cast is the same voice actor who played Jafar in the 1992 film. And they said in their book that he could not imagine anyone else playing the role because it was that iconic of a voice and they needed that representation brought to the stage. So what this really means is that it doesn't matter who's playing the characters, because the characters will always be identified in the mind of the audience as that character, as its own identity. They exist within this Disney fantasy, and what they represent as characters override the artistic performance. And so, yes, why am I saying all of this? Why does it matter that Disney's sort of investing into this new corporate market? Why does it matter that the industry is leading back and the artistry is leading back to the Disney fantasy? Like, is that such a bad thing? And that's where we really sort of start to see problems when we get to the ideological level of all of this. So if we recall what Adler said about theater being the truth of life and a social situation, we really see that Broadway has always sort of catered to a variety of different taste cultures. Now, taste cultures involve people of various socioeconomic statuses, genders, races, religions, sexuality, and Broadway and Broadway theater sort of has a universality to it in how it reflects the cultural ideologies of all these various groups, and not just your sort of general homogenized middle to upper white class society. And so there's that universality feeling in Broadway. And with Aladdin, Disney does try to sort of strive for this universality in some senses. They added 2 new songs, one for Jasmine, These Palace Walls, and one for for Aladdin, it's called Proud of Your Boy. And they sort of touch on these universal themes that extend beyond, race, religion, gender, all of that. But the problem is, and this goes back to the artistry, is that they homogenize all of these cultural values and subsume them under the Disney brand. And it's important because Disney as a cultural producer and other corporations as cultural producers, they have the power to create art that shapes content that is both enlightening and entertaining, that also educates the audience on cultural competency and allows the audience to make informed choices regarding their interactions with cultural content. But, and what they actually do is they only educate and reaffirm the own Disney brand, the Disney magic. And what that does is it really just teaches and educates people to be passive consumers within the Disney world instead of actively challenging our own cultural ideologies. And so we can see with all these findings, just to sort of summarize this real quickly, again, Aladdin reflects and reifies the ideological imperatives of Disney, as well as Disney and other corporations alter Broadway both structurally and ideologically. And where I'd sort of like to finish with this is that the same place that I began. Theater is an art form, and it's a pillar of our culture, and the ideologies inherent in that art, they matter. But it's not just an abstract thing. Theater isn't just happening in high schools or liberal arts colleges. Broadway alone is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and this study brings to light the importance of theater as a cultural producer and how it helps reflect and shape that reality. of course, this leads to sort of the weakness of this study, which is just that the overall scope of this project is too small to truly investigate the structures of theatrical cultural production in late era capitalism. To fully understand the meshing of culture, commodification, corporate entertainment, this study offers many more questions than answers. But it is through these questions that I really hope to inspire others to help them understand that the impact theater has on us. And through this research, generate even more criticism and more research into this important sector of cultural production. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. If you give us the screen back, we can see if people have questions. Oh, I see some clapping. All very cool indeed. Anyone have questions for Peter? We have a few minutes here.
Yeah. So, hi.
Hello.
So you were talking about how Disney handles identity categories such as race, gender, sexuality, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could talk about how Disney handles class identity, because of course you have to be quite wealthy to be able to afford Broadway, to afford to go see a Broadway production. So, and of course, Aladdin is a story about a street urchin. So could you talk about how Disney presents class in Aladdin?
Yeah, I think in terms of, are you talking in terms of within the show itself, or how the show sort of represents that at a structural level?
I suppose I mean how the show communicates it.
Right. So, I mean, obviously, so within the show, it very much, like, they do show the class stratification with, you know, Aladdin being a street urchin. But again, if you sort of look at the core identity of that story, it's very much easy off. I find a magic genie, and now magically I can be a prince, I can be a king. So, it, you know, it sort of does kind of homogenize these values and ideas about, you know, class stratification, and sort of just kind of glances over all of that instead of actively addressing the disparities that exist. You know, again, I think it feeds into that idea that they're trying to reach a variety of audiences, but what they're actually really doing is just giving sort of a standard generic blanket sort of message that comes back on itself to the company instead of actively addressing those disparities.
Thank you. I hate to cut you off. This would be a great conversation, but we really need to hear from Maddie. So Maddie, if you could take control of the screen, I'm eager to hear your presentation of your honors thesis work as well. And again, I'm going to leave it to her to read her title. Thank you so far to everyone. And take it away, Maddie.
Okay. Hello and good morning, everyone. My name's Madison Troha, and my thesis is titled A Guide to Going Inside. I chose to do a project-based thesis with the Office of Community Engagement, sort of as my client, if you will. By doing this, we will be able to create an informed guide for students and faculty through using evidence-based decision-making. So my argument is that after conducting this multi-method study, I argue that the College Behind Bars initiatives have the potential to provide impactful experiences for our students and faculty when the following three things are completed. So first, when a meaningful and sustainable partnership is established. Number two, when there is adequate training for faculty and students provided. And number three, there needs to be guided reflection opportunities throughout these experiences. So to begin with some background information, Juniata College and the prisons are two of the largest social institutions in Huntingdon, and there's a growing partnership there that I have become very passionate about. I personally took an Inside Out course a few semesters ago, which is just one example of a College Behind Bars initiative, or sort of a collegiate learning initiative that takes place within a prison institution. So Inside Out is actually an international brand. It's had over 40,000 students participate inside and out around the world. But it is a fairly young program here at Juniata. It only started in 2017 with Dr. Daniel Welliver. He taught an Intro to Sociology course in the Smithfield State Correctional Institution as the pilot Inside Out course, and there have been 3 other classes since then, another one taught by him and 2 taught by Dr. Allison Fletcher in our history department. In addition, as I stated, there are various other College Behind Bars learning experiences such as internships, language in motion presentations, fieldwork placements in our sociology department, the Read to Your Child program, and other initiatives that students have participated in. So as I stated in my introduction, this is a community engaged learning project because of the nature of these experiences that our Juniata students are having. The prison has grown to become one of Juniata's greatest community partners, and it's become a place where Juniata students have had numerous successful experiences, as I was able to learn through the interviews and focus groups. And finally, I use social identity theory to examine the value of these experiences. This concept has a strong place within the College Behind Bars experiences on both ends. Social identities are often challenged and discovered and developed in an Inside Out course, as well as the other partnership initiatives, just some more than others because of the duration differences of these programs. For example, an Inside Out course is an entire semester long, whereas a language in motion presentation is just a one-time thing. Regardless, though, guidelines need to be followed in order for it to be a successful experience. So the method that I used to create this guide to going inside was a multi-method data gathering process. I implemented individual narrative interviews as well as focus group interviews. I also implemented a qualitative and quantitative survey that went out to current and past students that have taken had any sort of inside experience. I used different methods for different groups of participants. So for faculty members and key stakeholders at SCI Smithfield, I conducted narrative interviews. A few of these interviews were one-on-one, and some of them were strategically grouped because of the type of information that I wanted to gather from them. I chose to split them up into groups in order to be able to draft different questions for each group, since each of them had something different to contribute. But overall, there were 18 students that participated in focus groups and the survey, 8 faculty members, a few of whom have already taught inside, some of whom have gone through training or partial training to teach inside, and some of them who are supervisors to students that have had inside experiences. And then also I interviewed 2 key stakeholders at SCI Smithfield. So after conducting this multi-method study in order to gain a better understanding of student and faculty experiences inside these local state correctional institutions, I found that overall these experiences have the potential to be transformational. With that being said, though, there is a lot that Juniata must provide in order to continue to foster this mutually beneficial partnership that is safe and sustainable for all constituents involved. So in my thesis, I have grouped all of the recommendations from the findings into 10 detailed steps that Juniata College should take in order to create a stronger partnership between our institution and the 2 local prisons. So today, for the sake of time, I have grouped them into 3 requirements that Juniata must implement in order for there to be potential for these successful experiences for our students and our faculty. Because we understand the impact that these College Behind Bars initiatives can have on our students' social identities, these steps have been designed and intentionally layered on the basis of this theory. So first is establishing a sustainable partnership. As I said, this is the first step. And while we have the support from our Juniata administration, as well as the administration at both correctional institutions, a memorandum of understanding or some kind of formal agreement needs to be established to formalize that partnership. In addition, we need to be more present in both institutions through the various College Behind Bars initiatives, whether that is Inside Out or internships or fieldwork placements. Regardless, they need to follow these guidelines that we have presented, go through the adequate training, but ultimately be more present in order to sustain this partnership. Next is training for professors, supervisors, and students. Of course, it'll look different for each of those groups of people. For professors, initially there was some controversy in the interviews about whether professors needed to go through the formal Inside Out training. which is the branded training where they would be trained by professionals. Our 2 current Inside Out professors have gone through that training, so we haven't had to face this before, but it was concluded through my findings that they should continue to go through this formal training for the sake of liability on both institutions' behalf, but also for the safety of our students to know that their professors have had adequate training. In addition to this formal training, professors should teach a 4-week trial course just with incarcerated individuals to kind of get used to that pedagogy, because it is so different from what they're used to in a typical classroom. And then they would be able to adjust their syllabus and the course content accordingly. As for the supervisors, even though they're not teaching inside, they also need to go through a training in order to ensure that their students are having safe experiences. So, for example, a secondhand trauma training, understanding how and when to start those conversations with their students, signs to look for in their students to make sure that they are being safe, but ultimately just to be a resource for their students on the colleges and to ensure that they are having a safe experience. For our students, it'll consist of some kind of Moodle component or a similar online database where there's interactive videos and readings. They'll have to take quizzes to ensure that they are comprehending the material, but also there should be a in-person component, such as one-on-one meetings with their students with their professors and supervisors in order to ensure mutual understanding of the students' motives, of the expectations on both ends of what the experience will look like. And overall, just to have a mutual understanding of what that experience will look like for the student. And finally, this should all be facilitated through the Office of Community Engagement. As I stated in my introduction, this is the office that facilitates internships and other external high impact practice opportunities currently. So it would make sense for this to be the home for the Guide to Going Inside as well, in order to create a more consistent and more reliable space for the facilitation of these training modules for all of our students and faculty, rather than everything being evaluated on a case-to-case basis. And finally, the third step is providing opportunities of reflection, both for our students and faculty. So prior to their experience, there should be a cultural humility training as suggested by Professor Jacoba Rock in our sociology department. This would be a sort of training for both all professors, supervisors, and students, where they would talk about and discuss concepts that are difficult to comprehend, how to acknowledge these differences in a classroom, oppression, discrimination, how everybody's social identity fits differently into the space, and how that will affect the conversations. By building this cultural awareness and this cultural humility, we are then preparing all of those constituents for more authentic and productive discussions with the incarcerated individuals. During these experiences, there needs to be reflective sessions facilitated by the Office of Community Engagement, where all of these students going through the experiences can come together and talk about what they are experiencing. As I stated before, there's potential for secondhand trauma when the incarcerated individuals share traumatic experiences with our students. So by having these reflective sessions, everybody can talk about what they're experiencing, how they're handling it. And then after closing that feedback loop, giving advice to future students and giving feedback to our Office of Community Engagement in order to constantly be creating a stronger Guide to Go Inside. Students can then talk to them about things they wish they would have known or what we can do better to better prepare our students and faculty to go inside for these experiences. So now that we've talked about the 3 requirements that Juniata must implement in order for there to be potential for these successful experiences for our students and faculty, I just want to end by discussing a few conclusions that I have come to in my thesis. So firstly, all participants in this study expressed in one way or another the weight of this growing partnership between Juniata College and our 2 local maximum security state correctional institutions, SCI Smithfield and SCI Huntington. So therefore, a Guide to Going Inside has proven to be necessary for Juniata colleges, and more specifically our Office of Community Engagement. As for the effect of these programs, students expressed during their focus groups how so many of them reference their inside experiences in other classes, in their resumes, and even during job interviews. Although it is too young of a partnership to truly say that it has long-term impacts, 100% of the students that filled out the initial survey about their inside experience stated that they believe it has had or will continue to have a long-term impact on them. Through these community engaged learning experiences, they have the opportunity to learn about and explore a huge social institution that exists within our community through these safe and immersive experiences. And finally, through a social identity theory perspective, inside experiences are necessary for all constituents involved when they are put in safe situations that challenge and even affirm their sense of self and their social identities. It challenges professors, corrections staff, and students, whether they are in college or in prison, to consider their social identity and their place within society. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie. We maybe have time for one question, maybe not even that. Does anybody have a burning question?
Sure,
Congratulations.
yeah, I think I got one. I shouldn't be too long. Yeah, so hi, thank you, Maddie. I think that was a great presentation. So I know that our Office of Community Engagement right now consists of one part-time professor, a JA, and like 2 or 3 interns, right? Do you think that our Office of Community Engagement is prepared to like deal with this program as it is and as it expands? And if not, like what changes would you recommend?
Sure, I think that definitely, I think that we're going to work on it this summer, just figuring out what this would look like. But I think it is feasible, having connected with people in the Office of Community Engagement. I think it could definitely happen, but yeah, I'm sure I agree that they can definitely use some help, maybe more students being involved. But by bringing in this experience, we are bringing in more partners within the Juniata community and the Huntington community that I'm sure would be willing to help facilitate this program in various departments.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all very, very much. Congratulations to our 2020 grads. I'm telling you, you made Juniata shine this morning. Well done. Thank you all for coming.